Hello and welcome to Marketing Communications with me, your host, Daniel Rahman. My guest today is a professor of journalism at City University London, the oldest and largest journalism school in the UK. For many years, she was a journalist in news and current affairs with BBC Television. She then left to found an independent production company for which she made several films about Africa. And she's published widely on international news coverage and the history of broadcasting. Allow me to welcome Professor Suzanne Franks. Welcome to the show. Today we'll be discussing the digital revolution and its impact on media. So Professor Suzanne, you read Politics, Philosophy and Economics, or PPE, at the prestigious University of Oxford, and you were also a Kennedy Scholar at the Harvard University's Kennedy School of Government. So share with us, how did journalism happen?
Well, I think I'd always been interested in telling stories, in what was going on in the news, and even as a school kid I worked on the school magazine, I did some internships in my local newspaper, and also when I was at university, both when I was at Oxford and later on at Harvard, I worked on the student publications, and I found that very, very stimulating and great fun. So when I came to the end of my studies, I applied to the BBC for one of their traineeships, and I was lucky enough to be chosen for that, and that's where it all started. And
how long have you had a career in journalism and television?
Ooh, well, I suppose ever since I started, in my early 20s, after I left Harvard. I had a career for many years as a television journalist. I also did some writing and so on. And later on, I became a journalism academic. So I did a PhD in media and communications.
So that's quite a wider range of experiences. And I understand that you're in Malaysia to deliver a lecture on making news and shaping views, riding the roller coaster of the digital revolution. Could you share with us what your lecture is about?
Well, I'm going to, I suppose, take a sort of quite a broad overview as to where we are at the moment in the sort of whole news ecology and how news is changing so dramatically. Looking backwards to the, I do a bit of a quick recap on, going back to the sort of 15th, 16th century when news first emerged as a phenomenon, and printing presses, right up to the present day, and how it's so dramatically changed. Whereas the emergence of printing in the 15th, 16th century, I make parallels between that and the emergence of digital communications in the late 20th, early 21st century.
Right. So speaking of roller coaster and kind of like the evolution that you've seen from the time when you started in the industry and then today, what in your view are the top challenges of the journalist industry today?
Well, the challenges today are sort of threefold, really. Firstly, I think we need to kind of keep the mission of journalism going, as a way of uncovering and holding power to account. And we can talk more about that later if you like. Then there's very much the business models, that the business models for how journalism is done have radically changed in this last period. And I think journalism has been struggling to come to terms with that. And then thirdly, there are the challenges posed by the huge tech platforms now, who aren't really journalism, but they make money out of disseminating other people's journalism, and that has a lot of problems with it, which we need to challenge as a society. I think we need to take hold of and to challenge.
So speaking of, very three interesting areas. You talk about the mission, the business model, as well as the role of technology. Perhaps we could talk first about the mission of journalism. Oftentimes we hear that journalism is the fourth estate to government after the judiciary, legislature and the executive. Do you see journalists today playing that role, or have they perhaps succumbed to other interests?
I think if journalism is to deserve the name, it still absolutely must be playing that role. I think holding power to account as the fourth estate is what journalism is essentially all about, and otherwise it might as well stop. And there's an interesting quote by one of the first American presidents, which was that I would rather live in a society of newspapers without government than a society of government without newspapers. And I think that, in a sense, says it all, that the role of journalism in a sort of functioning democracy is absolutely key. And just going to a ballot box every few years and putting your vote in is really not what makes us into a healthy democracy. It's the ability to hold power to account and to tell stories that sometimes other people don't want to be told.
And so I suppose one reason why that quote is there was because the newspapers were a medium between the public and the powers that be, and to keep an eye on check and balance. But nowadays we have social media, and there's some people who say that social media has empowered the public to be the fifth estate. What are your thoughts on that? On how media has the social media has changed this ability to check and balance the powers that be?
Yes, I mean we hear a lot about the so-called fifth estate, as you say, but I think we need to put a big health warning around that. Of course, there have been phenomenal, amazing opportunities that have come to us through the internet and through Web 2.0 and social media, and that can do incredible things and empower people. But it's also been a very, very dangerous phenomenon in many, many ways. You know, just looking at the kind of horrible trolling, threats, misinformation, to name just some of the problems. And we need to consider ways of controlling and making sure that these kinds of threats are held in place.
So that's very interesting, and we'll explore these challenges that have come from technology and media after this. We're going to take a short break. Welcome back to Marketing Communications. With me today is Professor Suzanne Frank, Professor of Journalism at City University, London. Professor, when we left off before the break, we were talking about the challenges brought about by technology. And in your book, Reporting Disasters, you cite a BBC report by Michael Burke on the Ethiopian famine in 1984. It was picked up by over 425 television outlets. This is the 1980s equivalent of going viral, I would think. But interestingly, you've mentioned that the cause of the famine was misattributed to drought as opposed to insurgency. And then this would probably be the 1980s equivalent of fake news. What are your thoughts on fake news and this phenomena?
Well, I think we've always had some form of fake news around. I mean, that's one example that you've just cited from the 1980s. But I mean, you can go back, you know, down the centuries when there were instances of propaganda or distortion. Very much during wartime, both the First World War and the Second World War, there were all sorts of misinformation. So I think fake news has always been with us in some form or other, but what is radically different today is the way that fake news or sort of misinformation has been monetized. Particularly, I'm thinking the sort of the way this really first came to the fore was in the 2016 presidential election, when you got youngsters in their bedrooms in Macedonia, just making up nonsense stories and seeing that they had incredible traction and they could push these things around the world and make a huge amount of money out of it. So I think that particular phenomenon, which we then became to call fake news, is something sort of slightly different. But there has always been a form of fake news.
But in order for fake news of this manner to thrive, there would obviously have to be a demand for it, or because how algorithms work is people have to click on the link and read it. So there must be an element where there is a demand. People are reading it or reacting to it.
Yes, I mean, absolutely. There's evidence to show that people are incredibly attracted to some of these stories, and they are phenomenal. I mean, I've clicked on them. I'm sure you've clicked on them just because you're so curious when you see some bizarre headline come across your news feed. So there is a kind of almost, I don't know. There can become almost a sort of slight addiction in a way to these sort of nonsense stories.
Right.
Just as people always seem to want to click on funny pictures of their cats doing something.
I'm
silly.
guilty of that, definitely. Cat photos.
Cat photos.
Yeah.
So the fact that we do click on sort of bizarre headlines is unfortunate, but that I don't think that's any excuse for saying that we should indulge in fake news.
Right. And speaking of indulging in fake news, there was an MIT research paper titled, and I'm going to read it here, "The Spread of True and False News Online," published in 2018, and it found that fake news was 70% more likely to be retweeted than real news. It also said that fake news was 7 times more likely to spread, or it took truth 7 times longer to reach the mass audience. And it also mentioned, lastly, that humans, not bots, were more likely to be the ones who spread the fake news. Why do you think this is so?
Well, these are kind of quite complicated matters, but I think if you go way back already to the Second World War, there was a famous saying then that the false news can be halfway around the world by the time that the truth has managed to get its boots on in the morning, and I think that's. You know, it's going back to that same phenomenon. It's much more exciting to see. I think one of the key headlines in the 2016 election was that the Pope supported. I can't remember. Was it the Pope supported Hillary Clinton? Was it?
Maybe.
I can't remember.
Yeah.
But I mean, if you see something like that, you think, really, the Pope supported Hillary Clinton? Let's click on it. Right. But if you came across a headline saying the Pope will not support, will not offer his backing to any of the candidates, and that's a bit boring.
That's right. No one's going to click on that
that's
one.
Not exciting. So there's a kind of a sort of urging, and somehow a feeding of this kind of phenomenon through.
That's right. And what we've seen in 2016, when we feed into this phenomenon, obviously there's an impact onto the society, such as voter suppression. What other impacts do you see happening in society today because of the magnitude in which fake news has proliferated?
Well, I think we're in a very dangerous situation where we have a whole sort of news ecosystem now where people are unable to distinguish easily between what's true and what's false, because they haven't really been sort of trained properly to understand, or the things have changed so quickly. You have armies of Russian bots creating things, and the same in a lot of other countries as well. And also the whole sort of mechanism of verifying something, of making sure it's true, is takes quite some doing. And we as citizens are often not properly trained or properly familiarized with what we need to do to properly understand things.
And verification mechanisms, right? Wouldn't the natural reaction be we should be our very own mechanism of verification by thinking about it, by critically evaluating what we see? But it seems to be that we are losing this fake news battle. What do you think?
Well, I don't think we can expect individuals to necessarily understand that. I mean, take for example, there was something circulated recently, which was Nancy Pelosi, the Speaker of the House. There was a video of her purporting to show that she was drunk and that she was unable to sort of control her words. That got circulated millions of times. It was then eventually taken apart, and they showed how the video, it's called a deep fake, had been manipulated. But if you were just an ordinary punter seeing this across your newsfeed, how would you be expected to know that? You don't have the techniques to be able to examine this in detail. So I don't think you can necessarily blame citizens who are, one step or many steps behind the kind of techniques that are being employed.
Right. And perhaps there needs to be something more, maybe regulation, maybe education. We'll talk about that right after this. We'll be taking a short break. Welcome back to Marketing Communications. With me is Professor Suzanne Franks, Professor of Journalism at City University, London. Just before the break, Professor, we were discussing how even humans sometimes can be fooled because of the sophistication of technology, and they are not necessarily the best mechanisms of verification themselves. So what do we need to do? Is education or digital literacy the way forward?
We absolutely need to place more emphasis on digital literacy, just as we expect children to learn how to talk and to read and to write properly. Nowadays, it's absolutely crucial that as part of a regular syllabus, they are understood how to decipher digital products, how to interpret them and how to understand them. And actually, probably not just children. I think a lot of elder people would benefit from that as well, because they say nowadays that a lot of the stuff that's circulated and not really understood is by older people on Facebook and so on.
Right.
So absolutely, I think digital literacy needs to be at the heart of what we offer.
Right. And from where you sit as an academic in journalism, what's currently happening in that space? Is content being created? Are people already teaching this? Where are we at?
I don't think we're taking it seriously enough yet. I think it needs to be mainstreamed in school, and actually from primary school, because I mean, primary school kids have smartphones these days.
That's right, yeah.
They share things on media. They're subject to possibly to all sorts of other things like cyberbullying. So I think we need to teach children as part of a mainstream syllabus how to deal with this sort of stuff, and also going right up to university. And I think at the moment it's being dealt with as a kind of special subject over here in one corner, but it really needs to be part of the sort of wider curriculum.
So people say, in education it's about the reading, writing, and the arithmetics. We probably have to add another one, which is like robotics or something outside, and from the context of digital literacy.
Absolutely, to understanding the digital world, not just the written world of of what the grammar or the sentences mean, but beyond that, how they're presented. Because most of our children now are effectively digital natives. This is their way of dealing with the world, of understanding the world.
And so the thing about education, though, it takes time, though, doesn't it? You have to create the syllabus, you have to roll it out in schools, you kind of need government support. Would regulation of the freedom of media space be something that's necessary to happen hand in hand with education? Oh,
absolutely. I think we've been very, very slow to this, and a lot of the digital big tech platforms have resisted it because they've said, oh well, we're just a neutral platform, and people put things on us, and not really our problem.
So you don't think they're neutral?
Well, the point is they are publishers. They don't like the idea that they're publishers, but they are. They publish the stuff, and they need to take responsibility for it. And I think they've very, very slowly begun to accept this responsibility, but it's taken a long time. And I think they do need to take responsibility, and they need to be held to account for publishing horrible things. I mean, a good example is this terrible massacre in New Zealand this year, where it was circulated online for quite a few...
It was live streamed for quite a few minutes as well.
Well, not just minutes, I think it was hours.
Right.
And they need to take responsibility that this sort of thing never, ever happens.
But don't you think that if technology companies, when they claim that they're just platforms which are about connecting people, start to self-censor, you're kind of going down a slippery slope? How do you determine what's the basis of determination, right? Whose values do you subscribe to? Whose freedom of expression do you have to limit? Do you not feel it's a slippery slope? Oh,
I think you're absolutely right. This is not easy, and it can obviously be taken the other way, that it can be much too heavy-handed. I mean, this is the American objection to it, because America, in the First Amendment, free speech is absolutely key. There's been great resistance to the idea of as you say, self-censoring, but I think we have to grasp this very uncomfortable nettle. And for example, in Germany, there is a law now against hate speech, which is very tightly defined. But I mean, hate speech of another community is something that we can understand, and that has to be removed in Germany within 24 hours. Otherwise, there's huge sort of millions and millions of euro fines against the perpetrators, or against the platforms for allowing hate speech.
How has it worked out? Do you know?
Well, it's just been going hasn't been going very long. But
Right.
interestingly enough, the tech platforms, for example, Facebook, have now hired hundreds more people in Germany in order to deal with this. And so, having said that, it's all too difficult, we can't manage this, they are finding ways, and I think this is just one example. But you're absolutely right.
Yeah.
I think the danger the other way is that there are certain countries which have used this as a golden opportunity to be much more draconian in free speech. So obviously we need to be aware of that.
Right. So just moving away from the tech companies themselves, because they are obviously a very influential platform, but the reality of the fact is media organizations are very much, there's a concentration in ownership, right? Meaning it's just very few interests which are being represented in the space. But one can't deny that a lot of media moguls, for instance, are funding or pumping a lot of money into media organizations. And as I mentioned a little bit earlier, in Malaysia, a lot of media organizations are having troubles keeping up because of rising cost. How do we reconcile, for instance, the business interests and empower neutral, unbiased reporting?
Well, that's another huge question, which is, there's no silver bullet, absolutely. I mean, we've always had media moguls to some extent, so I think that's got to be part of the ecology. But I think what we need really is a mixed model. We need a model whereby there's state government support, whether it's through tax breaks or through developing incentives for innovation. Philanthropy funding works in some scenarios, and commercial advertising led media as well. But I think the best environment is really where you have a mixture of a lot of different forms of funding, and that you can get the most sort of free and most interesting.
So would it then be that there really isn't like pure unbiasedness, but there's obviously some inherent interest, but the point is for readers, they have to be able to discern and refer to many sources? Is it a multi-source sort of approach that we should advocate?
Well, yes. I mean, I think, you can't have a sort of perfect independent model, and that if you have, for example, state funding, that comes with certain strings attached.
Right.
If you have a particular mogul or big rich, for example, Al Jazeera, which has been very successful, is funded by the Qatari royal family. So you have to understand that when you watch Al Jazeera. And the same with all kinds of other media. But I think you're right. I think a plurality and not relying on one particular source is a good way to go.
Thank you, Professor. Final question: what role do you see journalism play in this developing digital revolution with regards to kind of guiding society onto the right path?
Well, I think journalism should be playing the role it's always played. I think it should be, I mean, as a saying, journalism is there to comfort the afflicted and afflict the comfortable, and it should carry on doing that.
Oh, wow. Well, thank you very much for that short and sweet final answer. And thank you for your time. And that's all the time we have for today's show. And for our viewers at home, thank you for tuning in. Same time, same place next week. Thank you very much.